Today at the National Press Club, Chair of Universities Australia, Professor David Lloyd. As the biggest review of universities in years continues, tertiary institutions are contending with major challenges, from artificial intelligence to sexual assault on campus. But what role will the sector's peak body play? With today's National Press Club address, Professor David Lloyd.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club for our speech today featuring Professor David Lloyd. David is the Chair of Universities Australia and has been in that august position for an entire month. But he celebrated his 10th year as Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Australia earlier this year. David arrived in Australia from Dublin, where he'd been Provost of Trinity College Dublin, a 300-year-old institution that in many ways was light years away from the one he took over. As Professor Lloyd likes to tell the story, he's one of those kids from the wrong side of the tracks, with apologies to David's dad, George, who says there is no right or wrong side of the tracks, and whose life was transformed by the power of education. Instead of enrolling at Trinity College when he finished school, with his excellent marks, he instead chose to go to Dublin City University just around the corner. Why? Because I could go home for lunch, he says. However, Trinity College beckoned and he found himself there as a postdoctoral fellow following a PhD in organic chemistry, from where he rose up and up and up to the position of provost, as you do. Professor Lloyd's story is one that our current Education Minister, Jason Clare, once emulated and is central to his current university's accord. Professor Lloyd has been in the news a bit recently, something to do with a merger between two universities in Adelaide to create Australia's first new mega university in the past 4 decades. The question remains as to who will become its first Vice-Chancellor. Well, anyway, you can follow the conversation on Twitter and use hashtag PressClubAust. And please welcome Professor David Lloyd.
Thank you, Julie, for that warm welcome, and thank you to the National Press Club for providing Australia's higher education sector with this very important platform today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today in my capacity as the Chair of Universities Australia, the peak body representing Australia's 39 comprehensive universities. I do want to begin with acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose land we meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Indigenous culture has ever been in this place, on this country and our nation, for over 60,000 years before the first Australian university ever opened its doors. And 170 short years after that, our enrolments, our completion rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students still trail population parity and outcomes for non-Indigenous students. This is a time when all Australians should be educating themselves and reflecting on what acknowledgement really means and on the importance of the principle of constitutional recognition of First Nations peoples. We have a very, very long way to go. I would also like to acknowledge the people here in the room today. Senator the Honourable Sarah Hanson, Shadow Minister for Education. Mr. Tony... It's Henderson, I beg your pardon. Henderson. She's just sitting right in front of me. I can't read. I have a chest infection. Poor excuse. It's not going to get better, Sarah. No. Elocution lessons were not on the list. It's Irish teeth. Mr. Tony Cook, whose name I can get right because it's only 2 syllables, the Secretary of the Department of Education, members of the Australian Universities Accord panel, the Chair of the panel, Professor Mary O'Kane, AC, Distinguished Professor Larissa Brent, AO, Professor Barney Glover, AO, and Mr. Ben Rimmer, the Chief Scientist, Cathy Foley, the Chief Scientist, Tanya Munro, the many Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors who are here in the room today, the government's newly announced expert advisor, Paddy Kinnersley, CEO of Our Watch. Just a note on a collective noun for Vice-Chancellors. I once was asked what that was by Julia Gillard, and I responded an argument. So we shall see how my chairship goes. My apologies in advance, both for the accent and especially for the lack of subtitles. While I am indeed an Australian citizen, the speed of delivery of the spoken word that I have was honed on the north side of Dublin for the first 38 years of my life. And after only 11 years here, it's now running at about half Irish speed, which means the ambassador can understand me. But it's about 3 times faster than Australian listening speed. I should also expand that it's the tail end of bronchitis, which is underpinning my somewhat breathy delivery today, and not breathlessness from having descended many steps of my ivory tower to be with you. It is quite funny, though, that here in 21st century Australia, of all places, in this lucky country, where the fair go principle of recognition of attainment has cultural centrality, that it somehow feels there's been a sustained effort to portray the universities as bloated, anachronistic throwbacks from the 17th century, disconnected from community that we serve, or society, or indeed the national interest. And why exactly that would be is something of a mystery to me. Research that's been recently commissioned by Universities Australia has found that over half of Australians have a positive attitude towards universities. Now, more than half is not an effusive qualifier. It's certainly not 100%. But why is that? And what can universities do to address this issue? Of course, the same could be asked of government, which only 41% of Australians view positively. Or dare I say it, aside from Julia, the winner of the Journalist of the Year, just awarded. Our good friends in the media have less than a third of Australians holding a positive opinion thereof. This may come down to a matter of trust. Trust in institutions and also trust in people. But yet, and notably, the people that universities produce, the doctors, teachers, nurses, engineers, IT professionals and so on, are all recognised as among the most trusted in the nation. So I have to ask, how far does the apple have to fall from the tree in order for there not to be a link between the two? It has made me wonder why universities have not been successful in presenting facts about themselves to the public, when we're obviously quite good at instilling knowledge and skills in our graduates, who now comprise such a large proportion of that public. Is it that somehow our messaging is unclear or it lacks resonance in certain quarters? Or is it perhaps that in some quarters the message, and with it the sector, is willfully ignored? We know that the Australian population turns to universities as sources for truth and as sources of innovation and enterprise and skilled graduates. COVID-19 evidenced that incredibly clearly. University researchers were relied upon to provide expert commentary in over 67,000 media stories during the first 12 months of the pandemic. But somehow, universities have ended up as a ready punch bag or an easy target, used to score points in some inexplicable game of tall poppy decapitation without assessing the facts of the matter. Principal among these facts is that Australia's universities exist to serve our entire nation and everyone who calls it home. Yes, not every Australian has a university degree, and not every Australian will attend university in their lifetime. In fact, not every Australian wants to or necessarily should attend university. Happily, we're very well served with great secondary and tertiary education institutions which afford appropriate choice in education. But all Australians are better off for the presence and the contribution of our universities. That's an irrefutable fact. Now, before I get carried away in extolling the virtues of the sector that I love, and I lose my voice, I would like to dispense a little education if I can. Please bear with me, it's an occupational hazard. In Ireland, in 1854, 20 years before the foundation of the University of Adelaide, the first one, not the one we're building now, University College Dublin was founded by John Henry Newman, a Roman Catholic cardinal. Now, Cardinal Newman was quite an unusual Roman Catholic insofar as he started off as an evangelical Calvinist, and then he became a priest in the Church of England, and then he settled down and signed up for Catholic priesthood. He was ultimately canonised as a saint in 2010. Now, there's a metaphor in there somewhere for switching teams and allegiance to achieve greatness, but I haven't given it enough thought to make it truly funny. Newman is particularly relevant to our conversation here today as a philosopher and as an educationalist. When the Irish potato famine was, through disaster, creating a diaspora which would later populate far-flung nations such as Australia with my kin, Newman was busy writing a book. It was called The Idea of a University. The philosophy of that book has shaped the evolution of most, if not all, of the modern universities we know today, anywhere on the planet. And certainly it's shaped all Australian universities, the oldest of which had opened its doors a mere 2 years before the publication of the book in 1852. In the book, Newman argued that the role of a university was to educate the intellect to reason well in all matters, to reach out to and to grasp the truth. It's a very simple premise, but it was incredibly controversial in its day. If you fast forward 170 years or so to today, the idea of a modern university is something more subtle. There now exists a subsurface tension between the purity of vision of education for its own sake and contemporary government's focus on and society's expectations of education existing to serve the broader societal and economic ends. I contend that these two strong ideas of mission are not incompatible. Both are necessary, and no absolute choice needs to be made between the two. One critic of Newman's 19th century university said, "The young men are allowed to go out at all hours to smoke, and there has not been any fixed time for study." Imagine that, no fixed time for study. Smoking aside, and allowing for better inclusion and diversity, 21st century educators are working harder than ever to introduce flexibility to allow us to educate increasingly diverse populations of students. We're working to flexibly teach students how to think, to reason, to seek out truth through their education in this era of artificial intelligence, and through that education to overcome ignorance, to excel and to advance themselves and society. Flexibility in the provision of education is so much more important today than it was in Newman's days, and in his consideration of how university should operate, because, spoiler alert, education is not simply afforded to those who are making the progression from year 12 to the first year of university studies. While commencing enrolments in our institutions for students aged 20 and under have remained consistent, an increasing amount of mature age students are now attending Australian universities. This is particularly pronounced among those aged 40 and over. And these are students with jobs, with families, with obligations, with cares and concerns beyond the traditional considerations of a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old fresh from secondary school and eager to invest their hard-earned ATAR. These are the students from non-traditional backgrounds as entrants to higher education who are seeking to acquire new knowledge and skills to translate those to benefit. We cannot afford to continue to bias our thinking through a lens of belief in the existence of a typical student who can somehow be found equally distributed across our 39 universities. I can categorically state that there is no one-size-fits-all definition of an Australian university student. That unicorn does not exist. And from that, it follows that there can be no one-size-fits-all definition of an Australian university either. We teach and we engage with individuals, with individual needs and requirements. But up to now, a one-size-fits-all sectoral lens has been applied to universities nationally, and policy and funding decisions have been, in the main, unilaterally sectorally applied, even though we know they have variable local consequences. Thinking of and embracing the value of the diversity of Australian higher education as a system in and of itself, a system of unique and differentiated organisations, rather than as a sector with assumed equivalence and homogeneity, could well be an appropriate point for its further improvement. I'd like to take this opportunity, if I can, to put the word reform to bed, as reform infers a requirement to change to compensate for an inherent deficit or irrelevance. Our institutions perform so many vital functions on behalf of the nation, and in this pursuit they are not in need of reform so defined, but rather of support as they seek to further improve. Now, the benefits which flow from universities in Australia can broadly be captured under two themes. The first is the education of a skilled workforce that drives our productivity and economic growth, the workforce that Australia needs to deliver on its national ambitions and priorities. These workers, educated in our universities, permeate every corner of the economy, making it hundreds of billions of dollars bigger than it would otherwise be, and underpinning a higher standard of living for all Australians, regardless of where they live. The National Skills Commission's employment projections show that in the next few years, more than half of all the new jobs that will be created will be highly skilled, which means they will require a university qualification. Jobs in healthcare, professional, scientific and technical services, in education and training, all of those trusted professions that you cannot enter without a degree, are among the fastest growing industries. They are all professions that will continue to drive our economy and the societal advances that Australia needs. If university attainment doesn't progress beyond its current levels, modelling puts the cost to our economy of undershooting the National Skills Commission's target at $7 billion in 2026. Addressing this challenge for our national benefit will require us to rethink how we upskill, how we deliver units of education to learners in a manner that's commensurate with lifelong learning. The looming iceberg of skill shortage requires a much shorter turning circle than the provision of additional 3-year degree programmes if it's to be avoided. The ways in which we educate for attainment and our very definition of attainment must now be reconsidered. Now, timing, as we all know, is everything, and regrettably this is happening at a time when Australian universities are more financially vulnerable than ever before at any other time in our history due to poor policy and pandemic consequence. Any proposed interventions, however well intended, must be fully thought through. The second theme of benefit is the contribution that higher education makes to social cohesion and to human advancement through research and development. Research is a major part of what universities do, and Australian universities have a very strong record of excellence and impact. Now, interestingly, a colleague of mine was once party to a dinner conversation with an elected official, a holder of a very high elected office, and how can I put this, with significant influence over national policy. For the purposes of this narrative, I will fully anonymise that male person and arbitrarily call him Karen. On learning that their fellow diner was an academic, Karen went on to openly question the very need for research, to question whether it was worth progressing research in Australia at all, when clearly the fruits of research conducted elsewhere could be readily bought in. Now, leaving aside the fact that Wi-Fi, the bionic ear, penicillin, the pacemaker, printable solar cells, medical ultrasound are all Australian inventions which were developed by Australian university graduates in and with Australian universities, and all of them have transformed countless lives for the better, I kid you not, it was openly espoused, why would Australia not buy in the outcomes of research from somewhere else? Oh, hello. Welcome to Accident and Emergency. Could you just put your infection and your arrhythmia on hold, please, and your bronchitis to one side, while we wait for inspiration and innovation to happen somewhere else in due course, ideally in a friendly overseas nation who will trade with us to provide it at a non-extortionate price? I think you get the point. The impact and value of sovereign research and development is immeasurable, and no nation can claim to be thoroughly successful without it. Sadly, Australia's research and development activities are comparatively significantly underfunded, to our detriment. And I'll come back to this point later to highlight our sovereign risk, our systemic vulnerability, and our challenge to address it. Taken together, education and research elevate not only those directly involved in the activities, but also the communities that universities serve. These pursuits broaden our horizons, they fire our ambitions to think bigger and better, and they challenge us to go beyond the realm of what we know or think is possible. Universities are an indispensable partner in the delivery of initiatives underpinning this government's plan for a better future for all Australians. And this is nothing new. Universities working with government, and increasingly importantly with industry, have always been relied on to keep pace with the evolution of society, and right now society is evolving at an unprecedented rate. Digitalisation, decarbonisation, artificial intelligence, national security, climate change, a growing population, the health and well-being of all Australians. How we navigate these issues, and so many others, will define Australia's success, our safety and our prosperity in the coming decades. The two vital endeavours that universities undertake on behalf of the nation, that nexus of the education of skilled workers and the advancing of research and development, are only going to become more important as we confront these generational challenges before us. Challenges that are as myriad as they are complex. Recognising the innate interdependency of these endeavours is similarly vital. Now, these days, in some quarters of higher education in modern Australia, vocational education, the provision of skills and training, gets a bad rap. Personally, it reminds me of that classic comedy sketch about the class system in 1960s Britain, the one with John Cleese and Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett. If you don't know it, you should definitely Google it. But instead of exploring the absurdity of the class divide, we're looking at educational divides, where the same tall poppy decapitators look down on universities, and some within universities look down on vocational education and position it as somehow lesser. I think that's incredibly incorrect and incredibly short-sighted. Medicine is a vocation, teaching is a vocation, nursing, and so on. And these are the cornerstones of the Australian higher education system. Speaking of cornerstones, in the very centre of Stanford University in the United States is a blacksmith's forge. The engineering department there was built around it on a framework of explicit vocational education. Back in 1891, Leland Stanford wanted his students, all the children of California, to have practical education with utility and relevance and excellence and access in equal measure. Those 19th century Californian students and their successors ever since have been so fortunate to have access to education, which is augmented through visionary private philanthropy, another area where Australia lags behind in the 21st century. Australian universities could do much worse than aspire to revisit such goals. Equity of access for the realisation of potential, excellence in all facets of operation, and relevance in all facets of operation. We can and we must move towards recognising Australian universities as being a forge for this nation. A forge where new knowledge is created from many inputs and in strong partnership from beyond our institutions. Where education isn't only linked to the delivery of bounded parchments, but rather it is linked to the validated competencies of the successful learner, and where we learn how to measure and value outcomes, not inputs. On this stage, 3 short weeks ago, the Minister for Education, Jason Clare, released the Australian Universities Accord Interim Report, marking the midway point in the all-important Accord process. The Accord, of course, has the potential to shape the future direction of higher education in Australia, and the very fact that we are undertaking the process itself is firm recognition from government of the importance of universities and what we do for the nation. There's already much to welcome in it. The 5 immediate actions announced by Minister Clare. Universities have long called for the uncapped places for all Indigenous students and the removal of barriers to a university education for students from other representative backgrounds. The extension of the Higher Education Continuity Guarantee is a critical step forward towards providing the long-absent funding certainty that our institutions need to continue doing their job for the nation. We're wholly supportive of the removal of the 50% pass rule, and we support the government's intention to explore new funding models that are fairer for students and provide the resources that universities need to educate the next generation. I have, in my statements, already acknowledged that we are not perfect as a sector. And with regard to recommendations on university governance, our institutions will continue to engage with government around these issues to ensure that we are providing the very best possible work and learning environment for our staff and our students. We can and we must do better. These 5 immediate actions are measures that will help us all to do our job for the nation, but they are only a start. 15 years on from when the late Professor Emerita Denise Bradley AC conducted the last comprehensive review and examination of Australia's higher education system, it's appropriate that we would now examine the funding and policy settings that underpin our institutions. The strength and depth of the commitment of the Accord report to advancing equity and access and participation in education is something which Denise would have relished. She would have welcomed the attempt to support underrepresented groups, to address placement poverty, to meaningfully advance work-integrated learning, and to engage with industry on the creation of innovative and contemporary curriculum. And above all, Denise would have highlighted that participation in and of itself is not an outcome, that we must do much more to see that these learners succeed. It would be quite remiss of me to come to the National Press Club of Australia and not make the case to government for greater support for the sector that I represent and the enormous population that learns at our universities. Apparently, this is somehow expected of those who stand on this stage, and I'd hate to disappoint in that regard. Australia is operating in a fast-changing strategic environment. Our universities are vital to how we respond to shifts in the domestic and global landscapes. As a nation and as a society, the evidence all suggests that we need to do more, that we need more of what universities do and not less. And we need to do more of what we do in true partnership. In partnership and collaboration, not only with government, but especially with industry, for mutual national benefit. 2 hours south of here, construction is underway on Snowy Hydro 2.0, a nation-building renewable energy project that will help Australia transition successfully, we hope, into a clean energy future. In my home state of South Australia, we'll soon take on the enormous task of building a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines as part of the AUKUS initiative, along with developing other technologies which are crucial to Australia's national security. AUKUS is one of the biggest industrial challenges in our nation's history and is central to our nation's defence. Over in the West, Australia's push to become a critical minerals powerhouse is gaining momentum as we seek to capitalise on our comparative advantage in this field by using more of our critical minerals to develop products that we need here at home and add much needed complexity to the national economy. Such measures will help us to become a renewable energy superpower, which is also driving the development of advanced technologies in spanning defence, aerospace and medical applications. Nationally, the rebuilding of Australia's once great manufacturing industry is on in earnest. It's spurred on by the Albanese government's National Reconstruction Fund. This is boosting investment in manufacturing, from low emissions technologies and resources to agriculture, transport and defence, to create jobs, to grow local capacity and to breathe life once more into Australia's industrial base. Now, these initiatives all have one thing in common. The common thread through each and every single one of them is that they cannot and they will not be completed without the participation of our universities, either through the research and development we undertake or by the skilled workers that we educate. We will not get Australian-made nuclear-powered submarines patrolling our waters without a highly educated workforce guiding the construction process decades before the boats ever leave the shipyards. We will not get the thousands of new jobs and the economic boost that infrastructure projects bring to our regional communities and capital cities without the highly educated and skilled workforce which spends countless hours designing those projects long before this first sod is ever turned. These are national challenges and opportunities, and we simply cannot rise to them without universities, which is why we need our universities to be better supported, to be properly supported, to enable us to do our job for the nation. But this is not a one-way street. All the while, our universities will and must work harder to become better and more agile partners for their delivery. And yet, at a time when our functions are needed most, Australian universities find themselves more financially vulnerable than at any other time in our history. This is despite the fact that prior to the pandemic in 2019, Australian universities added almost $41 billion to the economy through the provision of much-lauded international education. Education is this nation's largest export industry. It's the biggest industry export that we don't dig out of the ground, and it's helping to pay for essential services that all Australians need and deserve. This success has to be amplified wherever possible, but it cannot be cemented in as a compensatory mechanism for a lack of sovereign supports to the core operation of our institutions. The house of cards that will be created in doing so will be more vulnerable than ever before. A decade of consistent changes to policy and funding settings have had terrible consequences, resulting in caps in university places, confused market signals sent to students, the abandonment of infrastructure investment initiatives, and most worryingly of all, government investment in research and development falling to its all-time lowest share of gross domestic product. This seesaw of corrosive policy oscillation and the accompanying funding uncertainty has made any kind of sustained strategic planning that any major institution must carry out almost impossible. Not to mention the unique challenges that were thrown up by COVID-19 and the pandemic, which further compounded our issues and which are still washing through the finances of Australian universities today. Now, in case this is seen as something other than a statement of fact, I want to take this opportunity to make it very clear that our universities and our operation of them are not about politics. We're absolutely about good policy, as we cannot do our job for the nation without it. This brings me back to Australia's research and development activities and our funding problem, or the Karen conundrum, if you prefer. Without criticism and without any casting of aspersion, it's in this domain that the Accord process could yet do more. Australia's spend on research and development has been in free fall relative to the economy for the last decade and a half, dropping us from sitting at the OECD average of 2.24% of GDP in 2008 by 20%, down to 1.8% in the latest data. While in the same time frame, the OECD has moved up by over 20%, but to 2.7%. Our investment gap compared to other nations grows ever wider. Higher education sector investment is the only element of national research and development investment which has trended upwards since 2011. According to the most recent budget tables, the level of federal government budgeted appropriations for research and development has never been lower, currently sitting at 0.49% of GDP in 22-23. The Labour Party took a commitment to the last election to work with business and universities to boost Australia's overall spend on research and development to almost 3% of GDP. 3% may seem a very long way from today's 1.8%, but even 3% itself is a very, very long way away from the R&D investments which are being made by other nations in our region. So pragmatically, just getting to 3% would be a fantastic start. Germany, the United States, Japan all spend more than 3% of GDP on R&D, countries that arguably lead the world in manufacturing and technological development. South Korea is sitting at around 4.9%, more than double of where we are. Outside of the OECD, Israel spends more than 5%, and even Iceland's investment of 2.8% dwarfs Australia's spend. That is not good enough for a nation of Australia's standing. I don't think any Australian believes we should lag behind like this, and it seems to me to be, frankly, un-Australian. Surely, at the very least, we should aspire to do better than average. Now, this is an essential ambition, and I urge the Labour Party to retain the 3% target in its 2023 national platform when it goes to a vote later this month. Declining investment in research and development puts at risk our ability to prepare Australia for the challenges and opportunities before us, while already responding to those that are on our doorstep. We do not yet have a clear path forward which can reduce Australia's research vulnerability. The Accord Interim Report acknowledges that, and it also highlights the significant and social and economic benefits of research and development. I need not re-prosecute that upside here today, but we must reflect on where we would be without it. Declining investment also affects our capacity to drive Australians' productivity, which, according to the Productivity Commission, grew by just 1.1% in the decade to 2020. To put it bluntly, we have a productivity problem, and we need to be doing everything we can to address it to move towards a more modern and faster growing economy to underpin a higher standard of living for all Australians. And again, universities are at the heart of enabling this. If we were to lift investment in higher education R&D by just 1%, To raise productivity, we could increase the size of Australia's economy by $24 billion over a decade. To reverse Australia's poor productivity fortunes, government must prioritise institutions, innovations and partnerships that drive productivity and that grow the economy in ways that pay for themselves. The people often assert that productivity is about doing more with less. But let's be very clear though, that is not the same as being given much less and being asked to do even more. Universities cannot continue to do more and more for this nation with less and less. The same can be said for Australia's need for more skilled workers. Here again, universities cannot continue to do more with less. That's exactly what we were compelled to do under the Job Ready Graduates Package, a policy intervention which was itself positioned as a reform. False nomenclature aside, at its core, the JRG simply cut the average level of government funding for student places while shifting the additional costs onto students and universities. I cannot be more fulsome in my criticism of the JRG. It has hurt and is hurting students. It has hurt and is hurting universities. It has hurt and is hurting the nation. Australia, not Australia's universities, urgently needs a funding model that's fairer for students, which sustainably provides the resources that are needed to educate our future generations. Skills do not flourish in isolation. They exist in an ecosystem. Passionate teachers, inspired town planners, skilled nurses, a vibrant artistic community, compassionate social workers, and informed ethical media. These are just some of the essential workers that our universities educate on behalf of the nation, and we need more of them. According to Engineers Australia, we are short 50,000 engineers already, and this number is growing. This will inevitably affect Australia's ability to deliver on new infrastructure. The defence establishment estimates that the shortfall of cybersecurity professionals in Australia could reach as high as 30,000 people in the next few years. With cybercrime on the rise, our security agencies will struggle to defend Australians. There are shortages plaguing our nation in education and our health systems. We don't have enough teachers to staff our classrooms, and there are too few health practitioners in our communities, in our hospitals and our aged care facilities. Australia needs an additional 85,000 nurses alone by 2025. A university qualification is essential in all of these areas and in an increasing number of others. Our nation's future prosperity, its vibrancy, its competitiveness and its social cohesion is all intrinsically linked to how well our nation's university system is enabled to deliver on its mission. Our vulnerability becomes a national vulnerability. A good university system counteracts this. A good university system supports the education of the skilled professionals that we need. A good university system supports the research and development that will continue to drive Australia forward, safely and successfully. A good university system is one for the whole community, not just certain sections. A good university system is deeply engaged with that community. The key talking points that are coming out of the Accord process so far all point to propagating that type of university system. A better university system. A system with greater equity, more opportunities for those who have traditionally not engaged with higher education, something that we have failed to sufficiently improve over the last 20 years. A system that supports learners as they reskill to meet changing work needs throughout their lives. A system where curriculum is shaped in collaboration with industry, where the student experience is maximised to ensure a smooth transition to employment. A system where the quality of our institutions is judged by more than just the broad brushstrokes of rankings, but rather is appreciated for the contributions to advancement, to society and to local priorities. A system in which research and development don't scramble for scarce resources, but can be inclusive, can be cross-disciplinary, community engaged, socially aware, and drive productivity without stifling creative imagination. A system where we can attract students to STEM without punishing the humanities. A system where new knowledge is created from many inputs, and one that is ultimately measured by the value of the outcomes from those inputs. A system where we never have to rob Peter to pay Paul or pander to Karen. Over the next several months, there will be much discussion and debate as the Accord panel's considerations evolve towards firmer recommendations. We owe it to ourselves and to the nation to interrogate all of the areas that are in focus appropriately and deeply so that the outcomes drive our universities and underpin their future success. Not every idea, spiky or not, will manifest as a firm recommendation. And as we evolve this diverse system towards having an even greater role in Australia's future, what can and what must manifest is a mechanism for the creation of a true sense of partnership between universities and government to assuage mutual vulnerability and to act in the best interests of future generations of Australians. Now, to paraphrase my late friend Terry Pratchett, a good plan isn't one where someone wins, but one where nobody loses. A plan for everyone, for our universities, for our communities, for our nation, and above all, a plan which manifests in the tangible, in demonstrable relevance, in the provision of value to wider society, so that no one ever has reason to question the future role of higher education in Australia. That's what's in Australia's interests. That's the opportunity the Accord affords us. We cannot let it go to waste. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for your very dense speech. If you hadn't been speaking at Irish speed, or even slower than Irish speed, I think we'd still be here at 4:30 this afternoon. So thank you. One of the big ambitions behind Mary O'Kane's and her panel's report is to double the number of university students by 2050. That's in 30 years. That comes with a big price tag, and I know it's not the panel's job to come up with how to fund these things, but it comes with a very big price tag. And the last time we tried to have a huge increase in the number of students, and including equity students who cost even more, there was no appetite for it. Within 5 years, the whole thing had just basically been capped. What makes you believe that the government, a government, and the government after this government, and the government after that, is going to be prepared to keep paying for those additional students that you say we need for the economy?
I think that the job of government, Julie, is to act in the national interest, right? And the provision of human capital for this nation and the educational attainment of this nation is in the national interest. So I believe it behoves both sides of government to act in a bipartisan way to commit to delivery of the highest outcomes for the nation's people. And prioritisation is always the challenge for government, but prioritisation of education, when we can demonstrably see the translation of that investment into benefit, is something that I think should come easily to any future government.
Okay, thank you. Our first question is David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and Age.
Thanks, Julie, and congratulations today on the award for Best Journalist in Education. Congrats. And Professor, thank you very much for your speech. I was very interested to hear you speak about the importance to the nation of fixing skill shortages. I think at one point you said the economic cost is $7 billion if we don't improve that university attainment. But it seems to me that that means that we're sending a message to young people today. In order to fix this national problem, which previous generations have bequeathed to you, we now expect you to go to university and rack up enormous amounts of debt. That debt now currently averages $25,000. Within a couple of years, given indexation, that debt will grow to $30,000 or more. Now, I don't know about you, but I know people who are turning away from universities because they regard it as a dud value proposition because of that debt. I know others who've signed up and then shelved their studies, again, because they don't think the value is there. So I guess you can see where my question is going. Do you have any concerns about this value proposition to young people today? Do you think HECS needs changing?
It's a great question, David. I think the fundamental assertion that HECS needs changing, the answer to that is no. HECS is a fantastic system to defer the cost of education until you're earning sufficiently to repay it. Where we have to be putting our emphasis is actually, as I said at the very beginning of my address, is conveying the value and conveying the message that actually is attained by those people who engage in education. So we have ample data that demonstrates that the attainment of higher education pays dividend on the individual level and at a societal level, far in excess of the $25,000 of debt. The linking of the HECS debts to CPI has never become an issue until CPI was as high as it is in recent months. And the repayment level thresholds for any individual with a HECS debt start at $51,500. So the HECS system itself is good. The way in which it's geared and the way in which our system is funded to provide both supports to the individual and to the institution is a core piece for the reform, and that's part of the Accord consideration.
Do you mind if I follow up?
No.
So when you say that we need to invest more to make sure that we can gain more graduates, are you basically saying to the government, fund universities more so we can have more university graduates, but don't change what the university graduates themselves have to pay. So there's no intention anywhere of reducing those charges that university graduates are going to have to pay.
Universities don't have control over the HECS bands. The JRG repositioned those bands in a way which universities questioned at the time and continue to question now. Having an equitable system, which is actually linked to the individual, and having an equitable investment, which is actually student-centred, is the important piece. And funding the individual to attain education. I don't think anybody should ever make a choice about what they want to study based on what their future outcome is going to be. They should be studying what they want to study, and whether that's in the arts and social sciences or in the hard sciences. And that's about an individual pursuit. Anyone who's making an economic investment in terms of what they want to do, in terms of the pursuit of what should be their ambition to achieve and engage in society, that's the wrong signal to send. So I'm hopeful that the bands review will happen as part of the Accord process, and that we'll move to a more equitable funding system which is at the individual level and allows people to attain education on their terms.
Thanks.
Claudia Long from the ABC.
Thanks for your address, Professor. Claudia Long from the ABC. As I'm sure you already know, Minister Jason Clare, the majority of the crossbench and the opposition and the Greens have all been quite critical of the university sector in terms of saying it's not doing enough to stop sexual violence on campus. We heard in July that universities had committed to a Respect at Uni Week next year. I was just wondering, have any Vice-Chancellors raised concerns about that program? When will it be? And will a National Student Safety Survey be conducted as well?
I'll take that in three pieces. I just want to make a comment that I've seen the comments from Minister Clare today and from Susan Ley, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, and I have no issue whatsoever with anything that they said in Parliament today. We have a significant issue in our institutions which we have to step up, own and be accountable for. And we cannot do enough to actually engage to deliver better outcomes for our students in this matter. I think it's worth remembering that the reason we are so alert to this is the steps that were taken by Universities Australia back in 2016 when we engaged with the Human Rights Commission in the surveys around Respect Now Always. And subsequent to that, the initiatives which have been put in place in our institutions are all aimed at actually providing better outcomes for students. The fact that 1 in 5 students experiences sexual harassment and that 1 in 20 students has had a sexual assault while in university is absolutely unacceptable. And every single one of the Vice-Chancellors here in this room would stand beside me and say that we cannot tolerate a single instance on our campuses.
Respectfully, though, that doesn't really address what I asked you.
I haven't got to the end of the question.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, well, then keep going.
Yeah. In terms of our processes, the idea that we would have a nationwide activity run in the future is one that's been caucused with our plenary today. We meet after this, so the Vice-Chancellors will be having that discussion later on. And in terms of running the survey, personally I'm of a view that the surveys give us an indication as to where the issues are, but they're not actually linked to the actions and outcomes that we have. So that's why I do welcome Paddy's appointment as the external advisor to the governance piece, who can give us hard evidence-based interventions which we can enact and translate best practice into better outcomes for our students.
Can I just ask about that survey though, because that was undertaken in the middle of COVID. There was so many students, as you know, that weren't on campus. Advocates and students say we don't actually know what's working without another National Student Safety Survey. That was one of the recommendations of the AHRC report that you just mentioned, to have that every 3 years. Will that happen or won't it?
We haven't made a decision as to how we're going to progress this, and that's part of the caucusing we'll be doing today.
Okay. And can you guarantee whether the Respect at Uni Week will actually go ahead next year or not?
Again, that's to be caucused today by the DCs.
Okay, so neither of those things are confirmed?
No.
Thanks.
John Ross, Times Higher Education.
Oh, hi, Professor Lloyd. A question on the same issue, really. So universities are copping a lot of stick about sexual assault and sexual harassment on campus, based on figures extrapolated from a survey a couple of years ago in which students were asked about their experiences not only on campus but also in bars off campus, private homes, etc. Is there hard evidence that the incidence of this sort of crime is significantly different at universities than it is elsewhere in society? And if it isn't, then should Australia be thinking about task forces for all the other places where this sort of activity is presumably happening, like clubs and golf courses and media organisations and everywhere, really?
Now, John, it's a really salient question. It's a really salient question. the data that we amassed through the surveys and even through the responses we see at our individual university levels indicate that the prevalence of sexual assault and sexual violence in campuses approximately reflects what's happening in broader society. But that's not a cop-out for universities to say that it's a societal problem. We actually have authority and accountability within our institutions to provide a safe environment, and so we should be taking every step we can within those environments to make sure they're safe. A lot of the instances that were reported in the surveys, in the two that we've had so far, have been in public transport, in the actually going to and from accommodation to the institutions. They're not on-campus activities. That doesn't mean that it's not a university issue, because we still have to make sure that our students are supported and know how to respond and know how to engage, and that consent is in place in terms of the training and provision we give to students, that they can behave in an educated fashion to overcome the ignorance which drives this kind of unacceptable behaviour. So while I completely take your point, and I think everybody will accept that there is a societal issue, what we have to do as universities is make sure that we're in the lead and actually making sure we take the steps that are necessary to stamp it out on our campuses as best we can.
Caitlin Cassidy, The Guardian.
Thank you very much for your address. Returning, if we can, to equity, which is obviously a centrepiece of the Accord interim report and kind of necessary to address these future workforce shortages. I guess considering that the HECS help system has been hailed as making university accessible to all Australians, why then do you think we haven't met the Bradley Review target of 20% of enrolments to be from low SES backgrounds, which is in itself below population parity? And why has it typically been up to regional universities to do the kind of heavy lifting?
Yeah. I take it from a sectoral position and I can give you a view from myself as somebody who runs an institution which actually has more than half of our students are from low SES backgrounds. I have a look to Barney Glover. Barney's certainly got the highest enrolment of non-traditional entrants of low SES students of any institution in the country, and is in metropolitan Sydney. Personally, I think that the way in which the Bradley targets haven't been attained is a combination of two elements. One was the capping of the system at a time, just as we were seeing the ability to access education become accessible to people. So we got a cap in 2017, 2018. That was a pretty retrograde step at the time, and it impacted on those low SES students. In the time that we've had demand-driven systems, and I do welcome the extension of the demand-driven system to all Indigenous students in Australia, we've seen a doubling in the participation of Indigenous students in higher education. But as I said in the speech, the mere participation is not the outcome. Right? I mean, having people come in the doors is one thing, but we need people to be successful graduates, to be successful learners, and to leave with skills and attainment that can translate into their benefit. And the supports, the broader supports, which allow people to engage in education, to be able to say, I'll choose education over a job, or I'll choose education over my part-time job, those supports and those gears are not in place. That necessary placement poverty issues that we have in terms of people undertaking work integrated learning, or people who want to become a teacher, who have to do a placement in a regional school, all of those drivers are extra to the provision of places in the demand-driven system, and more to do with the supports that are there to ensure that students can access an appropriate income while they're students. And the investment piece, going back to the earlier question, is an important piece. They are making an investment, but we have to make sure that we have the places in place for them, but also the supports in them to be successful. I don't think it's a divide between regional and metropolitan. I think that if you look across the nation, there's a good distribution of participation of low or underrepresented groups in our nation. But when I look at the data in my institution, the groups who have fallen away from participation since the pandemic are low SES students and Indigenous students who are making economic choices to pursue a job in the short term over education in the long term. And that's going to drive our skills deficit, and it's going to be to the detriment of the economy as well.
Can I just ask you a question on that while I've got you? So just talking about productivity, you talked about the productivity problem. Michael Brennan, the former head of the Productivity Commission, has called it the productivity paradox, where we've got the most highly educated society in history, and yet productivity is sluggish, if not going, well, it's sluggish at best. You spoke about research being a contributor to productivity, but we've still got, there's billions and billions of dollars, $11 billion a year or so going into research. But the new head of the Productivity Commission recently said it was because universities weren't producing the skills that the economy needs to boost productivity. Could you just respond to that? And, you know, could you just respond to that, please?
Yeah. I think it's there in the thread of my hastily delivered speech, Julie. We're currently being asked to address the iceberg of products of skill shortage on a 3-year horizon. Typically a degree program is a 3-year piece. The attainment and upskilling of individuals to meet skills needs in the economy can be delivered in a different fashion. The funding mechanisms which are in place are all geared towards funding students who are enrolled in 3-year programs, not at the microcredit level, not at the single year level, and not sustainably at the sub-bachelor level. So we do need to have an overhaul of the way in which we view attainment for skills shortage requirements and the longer term knowledge base of the economy. The two things are not geared at the same speed right now, and the Accord process is the opportunity to have that conversation.
Okay, thank you. Melissa Code.
Hi, Professor. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. You mentioned this sort of regard shift about the higher education sector as more of a system, and also the need to think more about supporting higher education rather than reforming it. And so from a policy perspective, and also with respect to the relationship higher education stakeholders have with the department,
Yep.
Why are those distinctions important, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I think at its heart, it will boil down to individual level agreements between institutions and the department about mission-based activities, recognising that a regional university versus a metropolitan university have different draw cards in terms of their offerings, have different constituents of students, have different costs of acquisition, have different costs of delivery, but yet there's a uniformity assumed that every student in Australia is exactly the same. That's not the case. Right? Students have different needs and institutions have different needs. And tailoring the supports for universities at the individual university level, decoupled from a kind of a macro one-size-fits-all piece, is the only way forward to make sure we have the appropriate differentiation and the appropriate supports in place for mission delivery at the institutional level.
And then when we also think about industry as a sort of third quadrant, how does that interface with this new vision you propose?
Yeah, so certainly there are nods in the less than formed recommendations in the Accord view around the creation of curriculum which links to industry needs and requirements. Universities don't operate in a vacuum. I think it's very important to make it clear that we do have contemporary curriculum which is informed by industry needs. The ability to respond on this 3-year horizon piece becomes a challenge because the accreditation bodies that are in place, which largely dictate what happens in the passage of professional education, they're on a horizon which is again decoupled from the end user. So having the end user voice in the formation of curriculum, in the articulation of skills requirements, and also in the ear of government in terms of the mechanisms by which we can intervene to deliver students at the pace which are needed by the end user in terms of this industry, is going to be incredibly important. Where that sits in the individual institution's relationship with the department will be about mission-based differentiation. For example, my university is incredibly linked to industry activities as a university of enterprise. I'd expect my relationship with the department to double down on doing that and to demonstrate we are engaging to deliver graduates who will be employable. Another institution may have a different view about what it is they want to achieve for their local region or for their capital city.
Thanks.
Simon Gross.
Simon Groves, Canberra IQ. I got this report that came out late last year. It's called The Skills Crisis, University Culpability and the Overseas Student Industry. Are you aware of it?
I am not.
Okay. It comes from the Australian Population Research Institute, which is part of the University of Melbourne. So it's got a bit of cred.
Depends what it says.
Its lead author is Bob Birrell, one of the eminence grisers of Australian social sciences. I'll just read you like a little excerpt that encapsulates what it's saying. At the expense of quality, universities have piled overseas students onto campuses without any obligation to provide additional teaching accommodation or campus services. In the management and commerce field, universities have minimised teaching costs by large-scale employment of casual teaching staff, sparking continuing complaints from domestic students about the quality of the courses. The result was a rapid expansion in courses that could be dumbed down to suit students with relatively poor English. As Leith van Onselen of Macro Businesses put it, Australian universities have, quotes, become middlemen to the immigration system. They've lowered entry and teaching standards to maximise student numbers. What do you say to that?
Is there a reference and an evidence base for the assertion? Because it does sound like an opinion as opposed to an evidence-based fact piece. I can tell you that in my institution, we've got 21% international students, which doesn't seem to be an overflow of international students. We haven't changed our entry requirements one piece to address that. Students have to meet the same entry requirements as domestic students. And I can also assert that in the delivery of education, while casualisation is one of the means in which we employ staff, it tends to be in areas where we put professionals into the classroom to deliver education which is actually linked to industry and outcomes. So I think that any assertion that institutions have dumbed down education to drive international education, I would refute. And I'd also go back to say that in terms of satisfaction, the satisfaction level of students, as evidenced through QUILT, is at its highest levels it's been in the last 5 years.
You basically said what your predecessors have said over the last few years. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Nick Stewart.
As Education Journalist of the Year Julie Hare pointed out right at the beginning of this speech, you've come just from South Australia, where obviously Uni South Australia, Uni of Adelaide are getting very used to the new idea that they'll actually become one university. That's obviously going to work. The question is...
I'd like to record that and bring it to the parliamentary inquiry on Monday as I go.
What a great idea that is. Obviously, New South Wales University, Sydney University and Macquarie University could co-join too. Ditto in Brisbane. Every state, we could really save a lot of money that's going on bureaucracy, and instead you could get a sharp end where you're getting universities focusing on particular areas and making sure that we're actually including all students at the right area, whether that's at a more vocational level for particular qualifications, or alternately for high-level research, august institutions like the ANU, which are specialising in research, and they're actually freed up to do that. Would you like to see much more territorial merging between universities? Or if not, why does it work in one state and why won't it work in the others?
My response to that, Nick, is that I'm a firm proponent of the autonomy of institutions to decide what's in their best interest. And in the case of South Australia, the University of Adelaide and the University of South Australia have decided that to create a new institution is in our best interests and in the best interests of the state. I wouldn't foist that from a top-down perspective on any other jurisdiction, and in many regards I wouldn't wish the journey that we're on right now on anybody else in this room. Having said that, I know that the destination on that journey will be a better institution in my home state. The evidence base that we have for what this institution will attain, and the opportunity that it affords us to rethink and redo and recast how we deliver education is absolutely, it's both exciting, but it's also daunting. And in terms of saving, the only guaranteed redundancy is that there'll only be one Vice-Chancellor in the future, so there'll be a saving on that regard. We've given a guarantee to all of our staff that there'll be no forced redundancies and no retrenchments as a consequence of the merger for the next 4 years. So it's not about saving money, it's about delivering better institutions. And if institutions decide that they want to combine to deliver better institutions, then more power to them.
So if it's about building better institutions, there's no reason why other universities shouldn't consider doing exactly that.
I think they're all watching to see how we do it first.
You seem to be arguing that you're exceptional. Why not New South Wales? I mean, why shouldn't other universities in Victoria consider it?
There's no reason. There's absolutely no reason why anybody else couldn't consider it, or may even be behind closed doors having those conversations right now.
So you'd like to see it?
I'd like to see... I'd like to see a lot of things, Nick. What I want to see is a better university system. Whether that's got more universities in it because of the way in which we may move towards the delivery of teaching-focused institutions as a result of the Accord, or whether it's going to have fewer institutions because of amalgamations to create institutions of scale which are differentiated. Either one of those outcomes is going to be better if it drives a better system.
David Denham.
That was a very good talk, and what I really liked was this mention of truth right at the start under Cardinal Newman and now, and I turned that into evidence-based, yep. And we're still arguing about it, aren't we? So even though we know more, we're still arguing about it. What I'd like to ask you is, you waxed eloquent about the research that's going into AUKUS, mm-hmm. the defence and the nuclear submarines and that. What evidence do you have that this is a really high priority sector to invest in, when we look at the recent history of who's done what, and we look at the health services and the other problems that we're saving? So what evidence do you have to wax so eloquently as you did about the AUKUS research?
I think my point about AUKUS was that AUKUS will not be delivered without the delivery of research that underpins the technologies that go into these nuclear-powered vessels, and the workforce in particular, the skilled workforce which is required for the production. The prioritisation question is one which was actually in the very first question I was asked today, about the prioritisation of education over defence, over health, and that's a government challenge. Where we as institutions have to be ready to respond is to be able to deploy our skills, our technical sets, our staff, our resources in the delivery of the solution to whatever problem is put in front of us. Right now, the challenge is to deliver sovereign capability in defence, and that sovereign capability is linked to a global relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, which will eventuate in the delivery of nuclear-powered submarines. We do not have the capacity in this nation to deliver those submarines based on the current productivity of engineers and graduates in our institutions. It's a massive challenge for us to upskill and to deliver those students against a backdrop of underfunding in the delivery of education in engineering nationally through the way in which policy positions have been geared. So it's a multifaceted piece. I'm not arguing the toss as to whether it's a prioritisation which is evidence-based from a university's perspective. In responding to the national challenge and being able to step into the delivery of the workforce, the universities need to be geared to be able to actually address the challenge.
The question, really, it's a government decision to put that in high priority.
Ultimately.
Thank you.
Our final question is from John Ross.
Hello again. Just going back to the Accord.
Yep.
So of the 5 recommendations from the Accord panel that have already been accepted and very much welcomed by the sector, at least 2 of them involved quite a bit of extra paperwork. The abolition of the 50% pay rule comes with a whole bunch of obligations on universities to have new policies that they may not have written before in certain shapes. The funding guarantee continuity comes with an obligation to spend any excess funds on supporting students, which presumably also involves extra reporting, as well as removing the possibility of universities using it for other good purposes like saving people's jobs.
Yep.
I'm sure these initiatives are really well intentioned, but is there a danger that they're pushing people away from fundamental activities like teaching and research and on to filling out forms?
Yeah, I think the industry of compliance is a significantly large industry in our organisations right now. And I've no issue with compliance in terms of regulation and providing reporting and transparency about what we do. I think that one of the key concerns I would have, and I think my colleagues share, is that in any interventions which are proposed through the Accord process, that we reduce the complexity of the system which we have, because we do tend to towards complexity. And as you say, complexity comes with overheads and reports. So if we can get to a more streamlined, less complex system at the end of this journey, we'll have a better system as well.
Thanks.
Nice job.
If you please join me in thanking Professor Lloyd.